This video provides you with a walkthrough solution for Excel Lesson 3. When you open up the workbook, you can see that this is a profit and loss projections workbook. And if you notice what's included in here, we have an entire year's worth of months, along with a total column at the very end. You have a section up here for all of income. You have another section below for all of the expenses. Then below that you have a third section for the profit and loss. And then finally you have a section down over here called assumptions. And then down here you have something for option 1 and option 2. It's always a good idea to look at your entire worksheet before you get started with a lesson. So the first instruction is to save this using your first name and last name in the file name. So you'll just go to the Backstage, Save As, save it to a location that you're going to have access to. I'm choosing to save it to the desktop. And again, in the front of the L3, just type in your first name and your last name. The second instruction tells you to fill in the total income, total expenses, and profit and loss rows with yellow all the way through column N. This you'll do it all at one time. So highlight the total income, then press and hold the Control key so that you can also highlight total expenses row. And again, keep that Control key held and highlight the profit and loss row all the way through columns N and fill it in with yellow. So you'll use the paint can and you'll find a yellow to fill it in. That's going to allow the user to see the separations distinctly between income, expenses, and profit and loss. The third one says, under the income, indent the two income categories 2 spaces. So the sales and interest need to be indented, so highlight the 2 of them. And in the alignment section, you have these 2 indent options. So you're going to increase the indent twice. Number 4 says, under the assumptions, insert a blank row above the bonus percent and type in target for bonus. And then next to it in cell B29, type in 35,000. Under assumptions, above the bonus, so you'll click on the row. When you right click a row, you have a context sensitive menu or a shortcut menu appear. We're going to click on insert, so a blank row appears, and we're typing in target for bonus, and we're putting in $35,000. Step number 5 says use a function to calculate the total sales and total interest for the year. Well, since we originally looked at the worksheet and we noticed that it had months all the way for the year, the total in column N is obviously the total for the entire year. So we need to use a function to allow us to add up all of the sales. So the function in Excel is the sum function. You can either type it in manually, or you can go up to this auto sum option up here under the editing section of the home toolbar. And if you click on the down arrow, you can see that you have a lot of different options. We just want the sum. What it first does is it looks above it. If it doesn't find any cells, then it looks to the left, and we just press enter to accept that. And we'll do the same thing for this next interest one, and we're going to accept that. Step number 6 says use a formula to calculate the total income for January and copy it across for the remaining months and the year's total. So the total income, since both of these categories, sales and interest, are under the income section, that means that those are income. So you would add them together. Interest would not be identified as an expense here. If interest were an expense, it would appear down here in the expenses category. So we can type in an equal sign. And since it says use a formula, that's telling you you don't need to use a function in this case. You can simply click here, press the plus sign, and click here. Kind of the rule of thumb, whether or not you use the sum function or not, is if you have more than 2 cells that you want to add together, you would probably use the sum function. But if you only have 2 cells, it's okay just to use a formula. But if you wanted to practice using the sum function, again, you just type in equal sum and add these 2 in here. You should only use the sum function when you're adding things together. If you're multiplying things, then you would not use the sum function. Step number 7 says calculate the projected expenses. That's in rows 12 through 16. So I'm looking down under expenses, rows 12 through 16. So it's this whole section that I'm going to be working with right now. Everything except bonuses because they require a different type of a formula. And it said these expenses are based on the percentages under the assumptions as a portion of the sales amount which appears under income. So sales under income is right there. And under the assumptions, I can see that I have a product assumption, administrative assumption, sales force, rent and utilities, and advertising. And you can see that those match these labels up here. And now the next instruction says starting with the product expenses for January. So I need to go into the January column, into the cell for product expenses. Multiply the sales for January by the product percentage under assumptions. So I'm going to multiply the sales under January by the product percentage under assumptions. So B7 times B24. Now at the moment I'm going to do something that's incorrect just to show you what happens. So if I only did that and pressed enter, now the next section says you will then copy this formula across for the additional month. So if I take this and I copy it across for the additional month, you can see that I get zeros in the following month. The note next to this says in the original formula, you will need to use absolute and relative referencing. And if any of these values are zeros, then you didn't use the absolute referencing correctly. And that's right, I did not do this correctly. I didn't use absolute referencing. If I were just to click in the very last cell that has the 0 in it, the December, and if I click in my formula bar, this is showing me what cells are involved in the calculation. Now, December's income, that's correct. The December sales under income is correct, but look what it's multiplying it by. It's multiplying it by a blank cell. We want to multiply the December sales by this product percentage under assumptions, which is way over here in cell B24. So we want the cells in our formula to be able to change in terms of the sales. So we do want it to go from B7 to C7 to D7. That's referred to as relative referencing, but we do not want cell B24 to change to C24 as we copy it over because there's nothing in C24, as well as D24. There's nothing in D24. So we want to put an absolute cell referencing for the cells that's referencing the product assumption percentage. So I'm going to press escape and go back to the original formula. You always should correct the original formula and use that to copy it across. So basically what I need to do is I need to remember that B7 should change when I copy it across, but B24 should not change when I copy it across. So B24 needs to be made an absolute cell reference. So you can do it several ways. One way is just to put a $sign in front of the B and a $sign in front of the 24. What that will do is that will kind of freeze that cell reference so that no matter where you copy it, that cell reference will not change. But the B7 will change. If I copy it across columns, then the B will change to a C. If I were to copy it down rows, then the 7 would change to an 8. So let me now take this corrected one and copy it across, and those values are no longer 0. Now when I click in cell M12, and I click in the formula bar just so I can see which cells are involved in the calculation, you can see that it is taking the December sales and multiplying it by the product percentage. The December sale has a relative cell reference. The product percentage has an absolute cell reference. Okay, so with that knowledge, you're going to need to do the exact same thing for the administrative, sales force, rent and utilities, and advertising. So again, equals, take the sales, multiply it by the assumptions percentage. So we're doing administrative now, but because we know that we're going to copy this across, we do not want this cell B25 to change to C25. So at this moment, we need to make it an absolute cell reference. To do that, instead of typing the $signs, you can press the F4 key on your keyboard and it will type the $signs in for you. If you don't want to use the F4 key, then just manually go in and type the $sign in front of the B and the $sign in front of the 25. Press the Enter key, take that, and copy it across as well. Double check, click in the last cell, formula bar, and you can see it's taking December sales, multiplying it by the administrative percentage. And just continue and do the same thing for the sales force, rent, utilities, and advertising. When you're finished typing in all of the formulas for expenses, except for the bonuses, And if you were to show your formulas, then you'd be able to see that the first cell referring to the sales was a relative cell reference, and all of the cells referring to the data underneath the assumptions are absolute cell references. Now moving on to number 9, it wants you to calculate the bonuses for January. So we're going to worry about this one first, row 17. So cell B17, and we're going to be comparing the January sales amount. So we're going to be comparing the value that's in cell B7 with the value that's in the assumptions for target for bonus. So we're going to be comparing that to this 35,000. If the January sales meets or exceeds the target, then they will get a bonus of a percentage of the sales, as indicated under the assumptions. So when we look under assumptions, the bonus that they're going to get is 1% of the sales. So we're going to multiply the percent for bonuses by the sales. If they don't meet the sales amount though, then they'll get 0. The reminder under here, it says use absolute and relative referencing. In this case, it is possible for some of the cells to show up with a 0. Remember, if they don't meet the sales target, then they're going to get 0. So when we're thinking about using absolute and relative referencing, remember that when we take a formula and copy it across, all the cells move. So since we're referring to some cells underneath the assumptions that cannot move when we copy the cells across, then any cell reference under the assumption should be an absolute cell reference, as opposed to our sales up here at the top. When we copy the bonus formula across, we do want it to look to the next month's sales. So those will be using a relative cell reference. Now we have to figure out how we're going to do this. We're going to be using an if function because there are two possibilities. They may get a bonus and they may not. So when you have two possibilities, you have to use an if function. So to invoke the if function, you can either go to formulas and find it under logical, or you can just simply click on the insert function tool next to your formula bar. That will give you a list of all the functions available. It shows up with the most recently used ones first. If you want to look at all of them, you can click on all, or you can see they have the same categories that appeared on your ribbon. If I just click on all, it has everything in alphabetical order, and I can just scroll down until I find the if function. But I did notice that if is a common function, so if I just looked under most recently used, I'm going to probably find the if function there. When you find it, click OK, and it gives you the dialog box, which will walk you through what you need to include in your if function. So the first part says logical test. So what we need to do is figure out what we're comparing. Remember that we said that we're comparing the sales with the target for sales, or the target for the bonus. So we're going to check to see if our sales is greater than or equal to the target. Because if it is, then it met or exceeded the target. So the target is down here in cell B29. Now remember, anything referenced under assumptions should be referenced using an absolute cell reference. So I have that B29 in my dialog up here. I'm going to make that an absolute cell reference by putting the dollar signs in front of the B and the dollar sign in front of the 29. So now that's saying if your sales meet or exceed your target. And at the moment it's saying false. This is kind of telling you for the instance that it's looking at right now, this is what it's finding. That's because our sales for January didn't meet or exceed our target. Now we need to fill in the second part. This tells us what happens if this is true. Well, if it does meet or exceed the target for bonus, then we get the bonus, which is 1% of our sales. So we are going to take this 1% under the assumptions, and remember, since we are using a cell reference that's under the assumptions, that should be an absolute cell reference. So we make the dollar sign appear in front of the B and in front of the 30, and we're going to multiply that by our sales, which is up here in cell B7. And B7 is not an absolute cell reference because we are going to copy it over for February and March, and we do want it to look to February's sales and then March's sales, etc. Now you can see at the moment, if we were to multiply those two together, this is the result that we're going to get. Now the last section says what happens if it's false. So in other words, if our sales do not meet or exceed our target, what happens? Well, they get 0. They get a 0 bonus. And you can see when it walked through all these 3 parts, for January, it's going to come up with the number 0 because January sales did not meet or exceed the target. Okay, we're going to go ahead and click OK. And although it shows up at 0, it should be 0 because 28,000 does not meet or exceed 35,000. Now let's take this bonus and copy it all the way across through to December. And you can see that sometimes we've gotten a bonus and other times we haven't. And if I move across, let me just look quickly at December. December, we only sold 31,895. That does not meet or exceed the target, that 35,000, so they did not get awarded a bonus. Steps 11 and 12 want you to calculate the total expenses, and they also want you to calculate the total for the year of the expenses. So we're going to use sum functions in this column, and we're going to use sum functions in row 18. Step 13 has you calculate the profit and loss for the months, and it says by subtracting total expenses from total income. So in our January, we're going to use the equal sign, click on the total income, and subtract the total expenses. So B9 minus B18. Press the Enter key and copy that all the way across. Step number 14 wants you to format all of your numbers now because we're almost completely done. In accounting, they're very particular about where dollar signs appear and where they don't. And also they're very particular that your numbers do line up. So their rule is on the top row of any category, you should have what currency it is. So the top row of our income is this row called sales, row 7. So that should have dollar signs in it because we're dealing with dollars. Now the interest should not have dollar signs on it because that's not the top row. So the second rule they have is any summary type statistics. Summary of your data should also have a dollar sign. So any total row should have a dollar sign with it. So that's why row 7 should have dollar signs and row 9 should have dollar signs. So now if we keep this going along, expenses is another category. So the first row in expenses should have dollar signs, and then the total row of expenses should have dollar signs. And then keep that logic. Profit and loss is its own category, so it gets dollar signs. So that's what the instructions tell you where they belong. And then it says also then format all other numbers to the comma style. Well, the nice thing about Excel is this currency accounting number format at the top will allow the currency symbol to appear, so you're going to use that where you want dollar signs. And then this comma option up here will align them perfectly underneath the dollar signs, so all other numbers get those. Okay, so highlight the sales row followed by control, highlight the total income row, and again control, highlight the product row, total expenses, and profit and loss. Then simply go up and click on the accounting style. It puts a dollar sign flush against the left-hand side. It moved everything over a little bit from the right-hand side and gave it 2 decimal places along with putting a comma in. Now when you look at all your other numbers, the other numbers do not line up with those. So that's why we have to format the remaining numbers as well. You can't just leave them as is. So we're highlighting the interest and all of our expenses underneath product. You're going to use the comma style. And now if you look at everything above here, all the numbers do line up perfectly. They put the comma where the thousand separator is, gives it 2 decimal places, moves it a little bit away from the edge. Do you notice with accounting style, the zeros are represented with a dash? It wouldn't be incorrect for me if a 0 showed up, so if you formatted it slightly different for the 0 to show up, that's all right as well, but a dash means the same thing as 0. Step number 15 says perform what-if analysis by changing the advertising percentage underneath assumptions from 10% to 15%. So what-if analysis is basically if you're in a meeting and someone says, well, what happens if we do this? What will happen to our numbers? That's why they refer to it as what if analysis. So what if our advertising changes from 10% to 15%? So let's go down here, changing it to 15%, and you can see that all of the advertising numbers changed along with the total expenses. In addition, the profit and loss values changed. Now, because those changed, it would be a nice thing to put those somewhere permanently so that we could see what the results would be if that happened. So that's why we're going to take those values and we're going to copy them under this option 1 so that they'll permanently be there. And then we can put our advertising back to its original 10%. So we want to copy the total expenses row, highlight, press copy, move down under here. Now we want it to go where this total expenses is. You can right click or you could click underneath paste. And we want to paste special. We don't want to just paste ordinarily because we don't want the formulas to be displayed under there. We just want those values to be permanently stored there. So I'm going to click paste and choose values and number formats and click OK. When I deselect them and I click under here, you can see that the total expenses does not contain the sum function. It just contains the number that it took from up here, that it copied from up here. The advantage of that is if you left it with the formula in here, when you would change the advertising back to 10%, then this value would change as well. And remember, we wanted row 34 to be permanently stored there, and we don't want it to change when we change the numbers back. So we need to do the same thing for the profit and loss. And you notice you have the scrolling marquee around total expenses. If you just press the escape key, that goes away. So for the profit and loss, we're going to copy it, and we're going to do the same thing, copy, and then we're going to move down to profit and loss. We are going to choose paste special and choose the values and number formats and click OK. And again, when you click in the cells, you can see that you have the number, pressing escape to get rid of that scrolling marquee, whereas the original one has a formula in it. Okay, step number 16 just says change advertising back to that 10%. And when you do that, your numbers up the top change, but the ones under option 1 do not change. Do the same thing, except do this for the sales force. We're going to change the sales force from 10% to 18%. And you can see its values are going to change up at the top. 18%, you saw the sales force values change. So that changed the total expenses, and that also changed the profit and loss values. So again, you're going to copy and paste them underneath. When you're done, you can see that under option 2, you have the values regarding your sales force change. And so let's just go back up to the sales force, and we're going to just change it back to the 10%. The last step says use a function in cell B4 to display the current date. We have a couple of functions that we can choose. If you looked at the beginning of the instructions, there's something called today and there's something called now. If we choose equals, now, open and close parentheses, you can see that the pound signs appear. That just means that the date is too long for it to show up. Well, if I were to stretch this out just so that I can look at it, you notice that now gives you both the date and the time. And this one only required the date. So if you choose now, then you're going to have to format this. So you can right-click the cell, move down to Format Cells, select Date, and choose any one of these that has the date in here. And when you do that, you can see that you have more room, so we can resize this January back down to its original size. So that's using the now function. If, on the other hand, we use today equals today, you can see that the IntelliSense description, it says it returns the current date formatted as a date. So it doesn't put the time in there automatically. Well, that's the end of lesson 3.